Welcome to this Fortuna Admissions recording with Poets and Quants. You don't secure your place at one of the world's top business schools because it's easy to reference a former US president, but that's probably true of many great moments in our life. Nevertheless, the GMAT and the GRE are an important data point in the application to the world's top business schools. Are they too important? Well, as the co-host of the Centre Court MBA Festival with Poets and Quants and my business partner, John Byrne, I get to sit down with the admissions directors of all of the world's top schools. And I have a vivid memory 5, 6 years ago when the brand new admissions director at the Stanford GSB, Kirsten Moss, we were in the NASDAQ Center in front of an audience of 450 consultants, bankers, software engineers. Kristen had been in the job 3 weeks. I've been fortunate to know her for many, many, many years. And the first thing that she says to the audience, she leans back in her chair and says, "I think Stanford's GMAT average is too high." Now, I was looking at the audience, and I promise you, I've never seen 450 jaws drop with quite the same level of synchronization. Are those now, of course, Stanford is in a very specific place. But I love hosting panels. My name is Matt Simmons. I'm one of the co-founders of Fortuna Admissions because I get to sit down with really smart, really insightful, really informed individuals. And today's Fortuna Masterclass on the GMAT and the GRE is no exception. It's a great pleasure to welcome my colleagues, Rachel Erickson-He. Rachel is one of the expert coaches at Fortuna that helps turn all of those business schools into a reality. She herself is a Stanford GSB alumna and a former GSB admissions interviewer. Also with GSB credentials, but adding in their Chicago booth, it's lovely to have with us Patty Keegan. Patty is one of the directors at Fortuna. She was a former associate dean at Booth and then an admissions committee member at Stanford. And we're also delighted to welcome Brendan Mernon. Brendan is VP at Inspirica Pros, one of the big players in test preparation and getting you ready, whether at undergraduate or graduate level. So a great bunch as we think about all sorts of things. Now, of course, the GMAT and the GRE are a part of the conversations, the very detailed conversations that we have with candidates to the world's business schools from all over the world. I think we once estimated it was about 140 countries. As I mentioned, my great fortune to work with this, what I describe as the dream team of former admissions directors, associate directors from all of the top schools, Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, INSEAD, London Business School, Chicago, Booth, Columbia, Kellogg. We've got the M7 covered, but it goes beyond there. And those calls are part of what we think is really informed insider guidance. And we take those calls very seriously. So whether about the GMAT, the GRE, and even test waivers, or your next steps to business school, we do hope that you will reach out and we can talk about your personal business school plans. Now, I mentioned today's panelists, and we've got a lot to cover. I've promised not to talk about football or soccer, as some of you like to consider it, so that the points and the scores that we discuss will be purely on standardized tests. But Rachel, Patty, Brendan, thank you for being with us. I hope that you're all well.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Nice to be here.
I should keep my intros shorter, but I know that everyone is eager for us to jump in and find out what are we going to be covering. Well, of course, the tests have changed, both of them. The GMAT and the new GMAT Focus, and then the GRE, shorter tests, but we'll be giving you all of those details. So we wanted, obviously, to put that within the application process, how schools are looking at these tests, what are going to be competitive scores, which one of those tests should I take? And of course, with Brendan on the call, all of his top tips for getting you ready. Where shall we start? I've got a long list, and I think we wanted just to look at how the tests have changed. And Brendan, that's a great time, I think, to bring you in and talk us through how the GMAT and GRE have evolved in the last 6 to 8 months.
Sure, thanks, Matt. Well, the tests have changed quite a bit recently, and I think that's mostly in response to competition against each other and market demand. And I think also in general, the market understands now, both schools and testers, which it didn't understand 10 or 15, 20 years ago, that shorter tests can be accurate predictors and give an accurate reading of somebody's level of achievement. I think testing agencies have known this for a long time, but they kept administering longer tests because the market believed that longer tests were more accurate, whether that be on the school side or on the tester side. But now I think it's pretty clear that shorter tests can deliver the same result, and competing against each other has been good for the testers in that a shorter test is more attractive. And since GRE and GMAT compete for market share, then they're the shorter test is more attractive to potential testers. So overall, how have they changed? They're both about 2 hours long. They don't have as much content on there as they used to. The GRE hasn't changed its content, it's just shorter. The GMAT has changed its content. Plain geometry is out of there, and sentence correction, which is a grammar section, is out of there. Why would they do that? My opinion, I think those are content domains that, from a tutor's perspective, and I've been a tutor for both of these tests for over 35 years, from a tutor perspective, you often start in those topics because you get the people to memorize them and master the material, and you're pretty much done. It's not that hard to pick your way through that material and reason through it as long as you know the facts and have those kind of down cold. So I think they got rid of those sort of to minimize to minimize the appearance of advantage of prep. As far as the GMAT, what's gone on with that? At least for now, there's a difference in the way the scores are reported from the ending in 0 to ending in 5, but that's essentially meaningless. The percentiles are different for now. I would not get too wound up about the percentiles because there's always a shakeout period of 6 months, a year and a half, 2 years, where the market responds to the new test and gets better at it. The schools look at the percentiles, and the testing agency sees how the overall testing pool performs. There's no more essay on the GMAT. There's 3 sections of 45 minutes each now, and the data sufficiency has been moved off the quant and into what's called data insights. So whereas in the old GMAT, the integrated reasoning used to be a thing people would kind of prepare for, but it didn't really matter. Now you are going to have to prepare for it, and it does matter, and the data sufficiency will be folded into that. The data sufficiency questions, which have always been a big concern forever, and GMAC loves that format. They've never wanted to get rid of it. For some reason, they've been in love with it forever. I find it really interesting to teach. They're going to take away the pure math questions on the data sufficiency. That is, you're not going to look at a data sufficiency problem and just see a bunch of algebra. Now what you're going to do is going to see like real world scenarios about, like a company, or something like that, where there's a description and then you have to do math in order to resolve it sometimes. But it's mostly, again, about reasoning. Anything else? Yeah, there's more data analysis skill overall. There's a little more emphasis now, since they've taken out the sentence correction, there's more emphasis on the reading comp and the critical reasoning. So those you're going to have to really prepare well for. I'll get into sort of how to prepare things like that. As far as the GRE, it's about 2 hours. It's definitely shorter than it used to be. It has all the same content that it used to have. The actual content hasn't changed. It's just shorter. And there's 2 modules for math, 2 modules for verbal. If you do well on the first one, you get the harder one for the second one. Probably anybody on this call, it's not going to be a question of whether you do well enough on the first module to get to the harder one. If you're in that situation, you probably have bigger problems. So, that's pretty much a no-brainer to get to the harder of the second modules. The question is, again, as always, just getting questions right. As far as GMAT versus GRE, we'll get into that, but that I think is a pretty decent summary of how it's changed. Oh, the GMAT, there's also, you can take the 3 45-minute sections in whichever order you want. That's really, I think, up to personal preference. And on the GMAT, within the 3 sections, you will be able to flag. It's adaptive question to question. You can't get to the next question until you've answered the one you're on. But at the end, you can go back to up to 3 questions that you flagged if you feel like, I needed a little more time on that one. So that's a little, I think, a little bit of attractive nugget that the GMAT put in there to I think, to attract testers.
Great. So thanks for getting us started with that, Brendan. We've got a shorter test. We've got greater flexibility, but perhaps, Patty, we can just step back and bring in a comment Brendan made about real world examples and not just stepping away from the theory of algebra. Here I am. Okay, so I took my SAT or my ACT in high school. So I know that tests are out there, but I'm enjoying this successful career. I've been promoted twice in the last 3 years, and my undergrad grades, well, they're pretty good. They show academic excellence. Stanford was one of the early adopters of the GRE as another alternative, but the tests are clearly part of this whole process. Just give us the context of, what you think GMAT and GRE is illustrating to the admissions office.
Yeah, I think it's really important, both Matt and what Brendan said earlier, is really focusing on the fact that these tests are now really focusing more, that's for the GMAT Focus Edition, right, on things that are relevant to a business career. So I think they've adapted to sort of this growing importance of certain competencies like data insights, right, with the new data insights section on the GMAT Focus Edition. It's also, so schools have been generally positive about that, I think. It's still very early days, as Brendan mentioned. There isn't a whole lot of data and feedback from the schools nor the candidates as of yet, but that will slowly or quickly change. So we'll get more information about sort of the experience and what these tests are telling admissions committees. But I think generally, from what I've heard and read, it's very positive. But keep in mind that GMAT and GRE scores are good for 5 years, so there'll be a time period with overlap with submissions, with probably the newer editions quickly overtaking the old exam scores that are being submitted to schools. And so one of the other ways that schools are kind of dealing with these changes, GMAC has published a score, what they're calling a score concordance table on their website. We also have similar information on our Fortuna website that helps kind of depict, what an old score looked like and what the new score would look like. So those are kind of tactical tools that schools are using to deal with these changes. Brendan also mentioned this idea of percentiles, which I think we'll go into a little bit later in the webinar, but there'll be much more emphasis by schools on the percentiles versus the raw scores in the exams. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Well, I'm sheepish to admit that I've been in the industry so long, I can remember the paper-based test when they brought in the writing and how these things continue to evolve. It was just a few years ago, Rachel, that you went to Stanford, so your GMAT must still be fairly fresh, perhaps still valid. It's a 5-year shelf life. Patty's already indicated, of course, sort of the drip feed of information. And one of the things, of course, having this transition, people have their old GMAT scores valid for 5 years. And then this new GMAT focus that came in towards the end of last year. Harvard Wharton said, no, we're not going to use it for round 1, but round 2, but other schools did in January. So tell us a little bit about, concern of how that new GMAT focus breaks down scores and what seems to be the case, that you're going to, that equivalent scores are lower than the old GMAT.
Yes. So first of all, I'm going to say I am also of the generation that took the paper-based GMAT test back in the dark ages. But yeah, what you said about expecting the scores to be lower, as Brendan mentioned, some of this may shake out very differently in 3 to 5 years, but over the next 6 to 12 months, based on the data that GMAC is providing and based on what we have seen, is the scores are going to be lower. People who walk into that GMAT Focus Edition test and see a 6 at the beginning of their score when they were expecting a 7, don't worry, that is completely normal. And as Patty mentioned, the way to think about this is in terms of percentiles and in terms of those concordance tables. So if you look at a score of 750 on the old GMAT, that was the 98th percentile. So that was the top 2% of all test takers. So fantastic score, great, you're done. The equivalent 98th percentile right now on the new test is a 705. That's a huge, it looks like a huge difference, but to the schools and when they're doing the evaluation, those scores are still the same. They're saying you're a fantastic test taker. Just a couple of other data points to benchmark: a 730 those concordance tables are saying is now a 675 to a 685, a 700 is a 645 to a 655, and then a 650 on the old test is now roughly equivalent to a 595. So we are expecting in the first years at least to see, and potentially long-term, we just don't know, to see the averages at the schools drop probably to the mid to high 600s, and then also more people with scores in the low 600s and maybe even in the high 500s actually get in. So that's going to be a big change, is the scores are just going to look totally different. You can't compare them. I can also get a little bit into some of those subsections because that's also where you want to have some guidance for what you're looking for. Historically, schools really cared about that quant score. And we don't know with the new data insights what they're going to emphasize, but we do know that the quant score is still going to be important because, as Patty said, the schools need to know that you can handle that finance class, that econ class, that statistics class, and do that work. So on the old test, a 48, which was a very good score, was 67th percentile, and a 47, for example, was 79th percentile. Well, the new test, all three sections are ranked out of 90. But that 67th percentile would be a, 82 would be 76th percentile. I think an 80 is that 67th percentile, and then a 79 is that 59th percentile. And then if you look at the verbal, you're also seeing sort of a, where a 40 used to be the 90th percentile, now an 84 is the 91st percentile. So you're seeing that scores are probably going to cluster in the 70s, probably the high 70s to the low to high 80s as your target across those sections. And then, of course, there's data insights, which is going to be particularly interesting to watch because the data on that is really messy because the students didn't really prepare that heavily for that section because they knew it wasn't part of their core score. And so we think, once again, that you're going to be wanting to target. So an 81, for example, is 90th percentile, which would be a great score. 75th is 51st percentile. We're going to think you're going to want a score that's above that 75. But we may see these percentiles change and shake out over time as students become more used to the test and learn how to prepare for it. And the schools, the test prep companies, and the tutors like Brendan are able to help their students, really knock some of these sections out of the park.
Now, you singled out the quant score, Rachel, and it's true. We often think about perhaps Wharton, Columbia, Sloan, Chicago Booth as unapologetically quant-driven schools. I can think of the old dean at Wharton, Tom Robertson, who used to say, problems are there to be solved by numbers. And I always wanted to ask his wife, Mrs. Robertson, what she thought about his philosophy on life. But Patty, even as we break down the numbers, perhaps you can provide that context of, how schools will look at this big transaction. Brendan said this is a big deal. It'll take a while to filter through. So how do you think schools are evaluating these new tests?
I think we're kind of a little bit more than guessing. We talked a little bit about how they can be analyzed. I keep going back to it's still early days, but schools generally are positive. I mean, it's a more efficient type of exam for their candidates. 2 hours. It tells schools, a bit more about what they need to know. Not saying that sentence correction and geometry aren't important in life, I guess, but it's more focused, right? These exams are more focused, in particular the GMAT. But I think it's also important, Matt, to emphasize that just getting back to that holistic admissions, that schools are still looking at candidates holistically, and they're more than just a GMAT or a GRE score. I think it's really important to emphasize that. This is like down in the trenches. This is tactical stuff that schools and candidates will deal with, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that admissions committees use those test scores as just one data point. I think that's really important to emphasize.
Well, I mean, with your background and experience, Patty, both Chicago Booth and at Stanford, you were reviewing files from candidates from all over the world, from all industries, their undergrad, even a master's degree in so many different areas. So did the GMAT play a role because it was one common data point that everybody would share? Was that important?
Yeah, it definitely was important. Getting back to the basics, that a standardized test allows admissions committees to kind of predict how someone will handle the rigorous academic work at the school. Right. I don't think that's going to be thrown away anytime soon. But it's also in context. It can't be taken out of context. We can all talk about, candidates who have had, really high GMAT or GRE scores, and maybe they didn't get an offer at a particular school. There's so many other things to look at when you're evaluating a candidate. That GMAT or GRE scores are just one. Keep getting back to that. With that being said, I mean, you need to be in the ballgame. You need to get close to that average score of the schools that you're targeting. But there are other things that can mitigate maybe a slightly less high GMAT or GRE score.
Right. Well, perhaps with a year, 2 years in the business school, the MBA classroom, candidate students will emerge focusing more on the opportunities, aware of the threats. But Brendan, certainly this is something that you're very conscious of at Inspirica. Here is one of those aspects of an application that a candidate can influence. Typically undergrad and GPA is fixed, it's done. You've had the last 3-4 years of your professional trajectory. So, the GMAT and the GRE are an opportunity to put your best foot forward and try to share competitive scores.
No doubt. I think what it comes down to, building on what Patty said, is where do you invest your time? So let's say you're trying to apply within the next 12 months. Where do you put your time? And having worked with so many people applying to business school, I think that because it's a thing they can control, they sometimes focus their time or mental energy on the wrong things. And I think getting at what Patty described as the difference between tactics versus holistics is really important. Thinking about the scores, let's just think about the scores and how you can compare them. So if I'm a potential business school applicant now, I'm 25, 26, 27 years old, and I'm thinking I want to go in the next year and I have some good work experience. I know I did well as an undergrad. I went to a great school. I volunteer places. I'm a great person overall. I find a lot of times people focus on the wrong thing, and they ask lots of questions about, for instance, scoring and the way the test is scored and the way the algorithm works and all of these other things. And ultimately, when it comes to the test, it's if you get more questions right, you're going to do well. And I think that they need to focus much more on how they think moment to moment during the test, how they manage their emotions, and how they manage their time and attention during the test. And I spent I spent about 6 months a few years ago, they just doing the sales calls for our company, and it was a lot of people coming in from all these various consultants, and they were, at the time it was like a lot of them are like, okay, I have a 720 on the GMAT, and I really want to get a 760, 770. I want to apply to the very top schools, and I want to be sure my quant is at the very. What are the things that I need to focus on? And a lot of those are on the data sufficiency. Can you actually do next level reasoning when they try to confound you? Do you have strategies and like resilient ability to when they because all of these tests, they're always going to have to, no matter what test it is, no matter what section, they have to separate the really, really good people from the very, very, very good people. Everybody who gets a certain percentile on the math is good at math, right? And some of them were finance majors, some of them were accounting majors, some of them are frankly way better at math than I am, and yet they're scoring much lower than I am. And why would that be? That's because on the quant side, this is essentially glorified 10th and 11th grade math, but that is presented in such a way and is complicated in such a way that it tests your ability to manage logic within a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes, whatever time you have. And so when you do it, people focus too much on things like the percentiles, on how much this is worth, how much that is worth, what percentage of questions are this, what percentage of questions are that, and that's all tactical stuff. So if you think about it on the holistic side, I would say you really want to try to make your prep as efficient as it can be, and I'll get back to that when the question comes to that. But I would say don't overinvest your time in the test prep and neglect working with your Fortuna consultant, working on your application, working on how you present yourself, working on interview skills. Those are things I think people think the testing is, and not to contradict you, Matt, but I think people think, oh, that's the one thing that I can control. Yes, it is a thing you can control to a great degree, but even late in the game, there are still other aspects of how you present yourself to business schools that are well within your control. So very, very important not to obsess over the minutiae of the GMAT or the GRE. Prepare as efficiently as you can, and I'll come back to that when there's time, but don't focus on the things that are wrong about focusing on your test prep, but rather focus on what you need to focus on to think more clearly during the test. That's the number one thing. It's all about clarity all the time. Every problem you encounter, it's about achieving clarity quickly. And if you focus on that, you can improve really, really quickly as long as you have the fundamental skills and knowledge. But that frees up time to focus on the other things that your consultant can help you with, which is hugely important.
Well, Rachel, perhaps I can turn to you in terms of what constitutes a competitive score. We framed it as, what score do I need for an M7 school? And the words of Kirsten Moss still ringing in my ears. Context, holistic. This year, Harvard published a median 740, but that still implies somebody scored above 740, somebody lower. How much lower? So, what do you feel is a competitive score?
So what I'm going to say is a competitive score is a score that is above the minimum that that particular school has determined is necessary for the applicant to be able to handle the coursework, succeed, and graduate. Like, that is truly a huge reason. I mean, yes, there's the US News and World Report and the rankings, but the real reason why the schools instigated these tests was because they wanted to just make sure that the people that they accepted were going to be able to succeed in the program and graduate. So I actually feel like I've seen applicants with scores that are well below these averages be very successful in the application process because they have spectacular work experience. They have really good, strong other areas that they can bring to the table. So I do want to keep that in mind. If you are a really strong applicant in other ways, but your score is below the average, it's more about convincing the admissions committee that you are going to be able to do the work than it is about like, oh, darn, I'm going to bring down their averages. Having said that, obviously, it's an easier question if you are hitting close to the averages at these schools or even above the averages. It makes it easier sometimes to qualify for financial aid or scholarships. It makes it easier for you to convince the admissions committee there's not going to be a question mark about your application. So you want to maximize your score is one thing we always advise, which is if you're taking the practice test and you're getting a certain score and you go in and your score in the real thing is well below that, that is a sign that you need to take the test again. And then as we've all said, what the exact numbers are, I mean, 740 is really high. We're expecting to see those numbers in terms of absolute come down with this new test for the GMAT at least. The GRE scores will probably stay roughly the same. But we also don't know what's going to happen in another 5-10 years. They might start creeping back up again to these really, really high numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like we saw this sort of arms race where every year the numbers got higher and higher. In fact, anecdotally, I remember having lunch with one of the admissions directors of an M7 school, and she said, "Oh, Matt, last week I was summoned to the dean's office." And I thought, "Oh, summoned, that's not one of those verbs that's very encouraging." I said, "Yes, so what happened?" So I went down the corridor, knocked on the dean's door. He said, "Oh, come on in." And he said, "It's okay, you don't need to sit down. This is going to be a very short meeting." Now, by this point, she's thinking, am I going to get fired? But he'd been looking at metrics of the M7 schools, and he said, it's unacceptable to me that our school has among the lowest GMAT averages of the M7. In fact, it's worse because Berkeley and Yale schools beyond the M7, they have higher averages. So with the rest of the team, I want our GMAT scores to go up by 10 points in the next 12 months. Well, they delivered. They actually jumped by 16 points in the next 12 months, but still. So it makes me wonder, Patty, in all of this, and certainly through the pandemic, some of the schools said, hey, difficult testing conditions, GMAT and GRE have struggled to move online, but now those options are available. But we're going to move to test waivers. Sloan was one of those schools. Kellogg has operated with that policy. There are several others that will look at alternatives. Darden is convinced there are many other ways to look at great candidates. Should we trust the test waiver? How does that look? Two candidates, similar profiles, and one has a great GMAT or GRE score, the other doesn't.
I'm not a huge fan of test waivers. I think some of my fellow coaches might agree with that. And the reason I say that is because, let me take a step back. During COVID, I think the context of COVID made a lot of sense for schools to start offering test waivers. There was so much hardship, so much anxiety, things going on. I think it made a lot of sense. What happened with those test waivers during COVID, a lot of schools got scores and scores and scores of applications coming in. And although many of them were really great applications, they were kind of inundated with maybe some applicants who, didn't put their best foot forward in terms of testing or their overall profile. So now that we're kind of post-COVID, I hesitate to say that, but I think now AdComs might look at someone not submitting a test score as sort of an indication that maybe they're not as serious about the school or about the MBA degree. Certainly, if there's an extremely compelling personal reason for someone to request a test waiver, if it's available, that makes sense. But just simply struggling to take the GMAT or the GRE is not a compelling case. In fact, if I'm on an admissions committee, I would prefer to see a slightly lower than average score rather than no score at all. I think it just sends a signal that the candidate is potentially not as serious about the experience, about the degree, or about the school.
Right. And Patty, seeing those scores, now, of course, with the GMAT and GRE, you can choose to report the scores, you can cancel them within a given time frame. But let's say, the candidate took that first score, it's a 630, 640 on the old test. What does that give us? Around 605, perhaps, on the new GMAT focus?
Yeah.
And they send that off to the school and stop there. Would you have liked them to take the test again? I mean, taking these tests multiple times, how do the schools view that?
Yeah, I think it's completely normal to take a test multiple times. Most applications ask if you've taken the GMAT or the GRE, more than once. There's a reason they ask that. I think it shows commitment. I think it shows that the candidate is trying to submit his or her best score, right? All other things being considered, right? It might be a timing issue, but if you're not quite where you want to be and you feel like you have a little bit more in you to get a slightly higher score, I think it's fine to take the exams. It's not a negative at all to take it several times. And I think Brendan probably has many examples of that. So definitely not a negative. It shows motivation. It shows, wanting to best yourself or better yourself. So definitely not a negative.
Right. And Brendan, you talked about clarity in this entire process, but grit and determination sound like great qualities too to exhibit.
Well, I think when you take a standardized test, you have to ask yourself, like, why following up with what Rachel said, why does the school use it? And, historically it was, are you sort of capable of doing the work at this school? And that's still true. I think on the math side, one of the reasons on the quant scores, they do look at them really closely. There's a difference when you work with students between someone who got through math class by memorizing the material and then took tests that were basically just a regurgitation of what the teacher or professor showed, right? There's lots of math classes like that where they kind of throw people softballs to make sure everybody gets a good grade, and it's exactly on the quiz and test exactly what they showed you on the board. But as you get further in math, or if you're in more advanced math classes, there's variations. When you take more advanced math classes growing up, you have teachers that throw curveballs at you to see how you handle them. And the GMAT is very much like that. And schools are interested in that. They want people who are able to think flexibly in quantitative terms and do so at a decent level. It doesn't have to be super, super advanced. It just has to be that like your basic high school math, you know really well, and you can move around it using logic clearly. So one thing is, can you do the work? Another is now, obviously, since US News and World Report came in with all their rankings many years ago, it's keeping up with the Joneses. The schools, want the higher score, as you said. So yeah, that's another purpose. But a third purpose, I think, that's a little bit underrated is that math scores in particular on standardized tests are seen as proxies for grit and determination and effort. That is, I think years ago, people used to think these scores were more fixed than they are many, many years ago, but test prep companies show that they're not. And people still come into the process thinking that like, oh, the smart people take it once and are done. That's not really how it is. People who take these tests once and are done, they do that because in some ways their life was the prep, right? Like that is, their parents were both philosophy professors and they had these conversations around the dinner table their whole lives, or their parents were economic professors and they had scenarios of logic using quantitative concepts put forward to them, and they were in all the math camps and all of that stuff. But people who didn't have all those advantages can also move up the ladder on these tests and prepare for them. And schools, especially on the quant side, at every level, they see the quant scores as a proxy for, do you keep trying? Do you sort of analyze your performance and then go back and work on what you need to work on? Because you can really move those scores. So take the test as soon as you're able to get a score that's in the ballpark. I think one mistake people make is when they start their prep, if they're gaming it out in terms of time, they think, I won't take it until I get the 99th percentile. And I think that's a mistake. I think you need to look at what is the basic score right in the middle for the schools you're targeting. And if you're, pretty close to that, take it now, because you don't know what's going to happen 3 months from now, 6 months from now. You could get a new assignment at work. You could get COVID. You could have mono. There could be a lot of things that happen. Scores in hand are useful. Also, going into the real thing, feeling it under real-time pressure, under the real format is very, very useful. And bright people, when they take it more than once and they think about it, they get better because they think, how could I have handled this situation better? How could I have made better decisions? So my advice to people out there, don't wait till you're at the 99th percentile to take it the first time. Prep to get in the ballpark, take it, learn from it, keep prepping, and then you should be able to try to improve your scores.
Right. And as you remind us, life happens. Liverpool may even win the Premiership, and with the celebrations that will follow some of our panelists, they'll never be able to focus on data sufficiency ever again. Now, Rachel, Stanford was among pioneer schools. We go back over 15 years, I think, with MIT Sloan to consider the GRE as an alternative to the GMAT that had been that dominant standardized test for business school and the MBA in particular. How do you decide? Well, no, perhaps first, the classic. And I must have asked this so many times to schools. Do schools have a preference for the GMAT over the GRE?
So the answer to that is no, they don't. But it's hard sometimes to convince people of this, because in the old days, they kind of did. And when I say old days, I'm not talking that long ago. In the 2016 to 2017 business cycle, 7.9% of the applicants took the GRE. Fast forward to 21, 22, and that number jumped to 22.9%. That is a massive shift in just 5 years. And I think people are still catching up with this new reality, which partly was the pandemic. The GRE had a much better rollout of their remote test. They allowed you to use a whiteboard, which, when you're doing math is kind of important. And the GRE took the GMAT took a couple months to catch up. But so now what I always tell my clients, even if they're a total quant, investment banking, private equity, finance person, yes, you can still take the GRE if you think you're going to do better on the GRE. It really is, you should choose the test that is best suited to your strengths and where you're going to get the stronger score.
I'm going to push that with you, Rachel, because typically a little over 200,000 GMAT test takers, those numbers have declined in the last 5 to 10 years, and an uptick with the GRE. But the GRE, of course, applying for all areas of grad school, that was part of the thinking of business schools, if they could encourage more women to consider business school as their graduate school studies. And you're saying, well, for the GMAT, if I'm going to be percentile scores that are compared to all of these international students that may have been studying for months and months on this one. Whereas, someone might be taking the GRE for a master's program that doesn't have that same quant focus. So you reflect how the schools are using it. What the numbers are now, about 35% of the HBS intake successfully applied with the GRE?
I think it's roughly that. The numbers are changing, but what I see is they're trending up. And I see with my personal client base probably a 60-40 split, and the GRE test takers are just as successful as the GMAT test takers. It's really about having that strong score. And I also think what you want to do is you don't want to, for the GMAT, I think there's very specific historical evidence in terms of the percentiles that's going to be useful. That is against other business school applicants. For the GRE, it's a little bit more about looking at the averages for the GRE. Don't say, oh, this GMAT score compares to this GRE score. Look at the school's historical GRE performance and gauge your application against that. Because once again, all these schools now have data for all their applicants for the GRE and the GMAT in terms of what does a successful GRE score for our particular curriculum and for our course of study, what do you need to succeed? So you really should just look at the GRE, look at the averages for the GRE at that school, and then think about that.
Right. We'll be turning to Brendan as we conclude this session for some tips and strategies for these tests. But I have one final question for Paddy. Perhaps, taking an online practice test for GMAT and GRE could also be an indicator, but perhaps also, Patty, when a candidate will look to do this, making that progress, because there are all of these other aspects, researching the schools, sitting down with your recommenders, and of course the very thoughtful introspection that is included in the GMAT. So if round one deadlines start on September the 8th, it's not, oh, well, I'll book my GMAT or GRE test on September 7th. How do you like to fit it into that wider timeframe?
I think based on the clients that I've worked with and what I've heard, the preparation is kind of simultaneous a bit. I've had clients who just want to focus on the test first and then not talk about everything else. They just don't want to even talk about essays or recommenders. They just want to focus on the exam. But I think those who kind of do it hand in hand, who are kind of prepping, take their test, their practice exams, in addition to being introspective and thinking about these other things, are the, I guess, more successful, if you will, easier for me to work with, if you will, that they don't just completely, focus on the exam at the expense of everything else. And there are going to be people who want to focus and compartmentalize that way. But my experience has been that people who think holistically and testing is part of the overall application process, I think is the way to go. But I'm sure Rachel has examples of many other people and who do something different. And Brendan is probably dealing with those people who are just focused on the exam. As
Well,
opposed
I'm
to
sure we see a little bit of, but
application.
certainly with the emphasis we place at Fortuna on enjoying this opportunity to step back, really think about what next steps in life, what you're really looking for. And that excitement, I think, can also carry someone through as they're saying, how much time can I carve out every week, to work through these multiple choice questions? So everyone will have their own approach. But Brendan,
And
as
that's
we draw
that's
this,
part of what we do as consultants, right? We kind of lay out what a decent work plan would look like given work schedules and other time commitments, so that the candidate is comfortable and agrees to sort of that work plan progress.
Yeah, I can sort of hear some of them so excited as they come back from their campus visit, or they've thinking about sharing their story and how all of this fits into that overall admissions process. So, Brendan, if we can wrap up just with just some tips that you think candidates really should take away as they take on the next steps of GMAT and GRE.
Well, back briefly to the whole GMAT versus GRE, how to choose which one is better for you. If you listen to the consultants here, they'll tell you it's, the schools are somewhat agnostic. Although, yeah, I can also tell you that the scuttlebutt among students is usually, I feel like they like the GMAT better. But I think the consultants know, and you can just listen to the numbers, and that's not necessarily the case. As far as choosing it, I think it's again a thing that people can get too technical about. I agree. Just take one of each, see which one feels better to you. If you enjoy one more, you'll probably want to put the time in to prepare. It's not necessarily one or the other. Um, so, if you have a big vocabulary, that's going to lead you more toward the GRE. If your undergraduate major was something that, had a lot of reading in it, philosophy major, something like that, the vocabulary on the GRE has never been easy, and it probably never will be easy, because that test is also used for graduate students in art history and things like that. And those programs want people with big vocabularies. So that's, I think, one factor, because learning vocabulary does take time. It's probably the one aspect of test prep that takes the longest. And that's not necessarily something you can move the needle on substantially in 3 months. So that's one factor I think that needs to be considered in GMAT versus GRE. So beyond that, I would say if there's anybody on this call or on this recording that is an undergraduate senior, I think one really solid plan would be, if you can and you think you're going to apply for an MBA in a few years, try to take the GRE sometime during that year. And the reason I say the GRE, I think it's less difficult to learn the format than the GMAT. And I think the math is just a little bit more along the lines of what you did in school in terms of the presentation. And I think that if you can say, okay, I'm going to use my vacations, my spring break, my winter break, my summer when I have a lot of free time. And if you take your offer for your first job in, say, September after your graduation, you spend the whole summer studying the GRE. If you get a really high score on it, now you're making your life a lot easier a few years from now when you start the whole application process. So if you were historically in high school, like you got, 750s on your SATs, and you're thinking about doing the MBA, I would very strongly consider, if you were in a good undergraduate program with a lot of reading, to take the GRE during my senior year. For people that are in their mid-20s, I would think about working backwards. Just when do you want to apply? And typically, you want to see about where are you. If you're in the 50th percentile and you're trying to get like the 96th percentile, that's a 2 to 3 standard deviation movement. And that's typically, if you have a lot of time and you're working with a good tutor and you're really insightful and you do all your work, etc., the guideline is basically 3 months for 1 standard deviation. So you're looking at 6, 9 months if you have to make that kind of movement. That may be that you have to put if you're trying to get to the very best and you're scoring like a 530, but you're trying to get a 760 type of thing, that may be that you need to really seriously consider applying a year from now, which is not that big of a deal in terms of the arc of your life. But you have to build up lots of really fundamental skills in your verbal reasoning and your quantitative reasoning, and in just your ability to do multiple step problems within the time given. And that doesn't happen instantly. Sometimes those are more fundamental, like, education deficits that have to be worked on. If you're already in the 80th or 85th or 90th percentile and you're trying to get to the 96th, 97th, 99th, yes, you can do that in 3 to 4 months, but think realistically with your Fortuna consultant about what your time looks like and where you're going to spend your time. I've seen so many, especially MBA applicants, who are like, oh, I'm going to make this schedule and I'll get 4 hours of sleep a night for the next 4 months. And they just never do, because they just get tired, and like, you're human. So just really be realistic about that. Engage with Fortuna as early as possible. Be realistic about, are you going to need help? What a tutor does for you in terms of test prep, tutors can explain things really well for you. But a lot of times I tell people are like, wow, you do this whole tutoring thing. Like, what are you, and parents or students themselves will say to me, you say something to me that I just read in the book, but somehow I understood it better. And there is a lot of that. Most of what you need to know, it's out there somewhere on a website or in a book. What a tutor will do for you is encourage you, keep you focused. But really, the biggest thing you do as a tutor that helps students when they take the test is where to apply their attention, in what order, and like where to go through the process of thinking through the problem that is presented to them. And I learned that best when I had to write problems for the company that I used to work for. We wrote simulated problems for all the different tests, including the GMAT and the GRE, and I was in charge of groups of people to do that. And when you think about how they have to put the problem together, remember, their goal is always to separate people. You cannot have clusters of people where 40% of the people are all getting the top score. That is utterly useless to the schools if 40% of the people are getting almost perfect or perfect. So how do they separate a lot of people who are really smart? So some of them will get them correct and some of them won't. And what they do is they dial up the complexity, or they put a trap door in it that you can fall through, or they do like a sleight of hand thing where you're looking one way thinking this is what's important and it's something else that's important. Or they use a word that is commonly misconstrued and you misconstrue it. There's lots of different ways they can throw you off. A tutor can make you much more efficient in knowing what those are. Whereas a lot of students, when they come into it, they really, really think it's all about overpowering the test. And that's not to say that effort isn't a big, big part of it. Time spent does correlate, time spent preparing does correlate with higher scores for sure. But if you keep just spending this time doing the same thing, looking at it the same way, it can in fact be counterproductive in that you keep reinforcing a mediocre way of approaching the problems and the section. This is particularly important with dealing with the adaptive scoring on the GMAT. That's very much of a vibe thing. Nobody can tell you except for the people, in the inner circle at the GMAT can tell you exactly how that operates, but you can understand it by feel. And a lot of people respond to it improperly. And how you react to the algorithm in your behavior during the test, both mentally and emotionally, is massively important for getting up to the very highest percentiles. Getting to high percentiles is mostly just about mastering content. Getting to the highest percentiles is about mastering how you handle the algorithm, how you handle the experience of the test in terms of your emotions and just the nervousness. And also, are you able to ramp it up to the next level of complexity of the reasoning without getting lost? Those are things that to get there require really sensitive prep. And you have to do that while you're trying to do the thing that the consultant said just now, which is really important. You, Matt, said it's an opportunity to take a step back and think about the arc of your life and who you are and what you want out of life, which is a fantastic opportunity in any application process, but especially the B school application process. But while you're doing that, you have to critique how you go about thinking in, a really sort of sensitive instrument of a test. That's where really good prep can make a big difference and make you more efficient.
Well, I feel with all of this talk of trapdoors and looking this while where they send you that way, it's almost like the illusionists of Las Vegas rather than the research that goes on in Virginia from the GMAC and the GRE. But thank you. There's actually one final thought that I'd like to leave all of our viewers with. Really interesting research the business schools themselves have done when they looked at candidates that they had admitted and the careers that they'd gone on to enjoy, the successes that they had had. And they found a correlation between someone who perhaps had a lower GMAT or GRE score, but was offered a place in the program. This is equally true for someone that began on the wait list and then got off the wait list into the program. I think they were so delighted with the admissions offer that they received. They then brought everything with them to business school, made a tremendous success of it, and that followed through the rest of their lives. And I think that speaks, Rachel, to your point about bringing out those stories. Of course, as Brendan has emphasized, having a plan, that clarity that you require. But I know with Patty and the rest of our colleagues at Fortuna, the joy that we have of this introspection and really thinking about what accomplishments mean, change lives. It doesn't have to be 750,000 people. It could be a member of your family, but it's something that you've still achieved. Well, we covered a lot of ground, and maybe this weekend, after you've all sat and watched, you'll be taking that practice GMAT or GRE to get that benchmark test and a sense of the work that now is in front of you. We're delighted that you could join us for this session. We'll be, of course, available for connecting with you, talking about your story, where these tests fit with all of the other accomplishments that you have to share. So, please do reach out to us at Fortuna so that we can talk in much more detail about where you're headed, where business school fits in with your plans. Now I've got a messy screen. This is the one that I wanted. There we go. So many of these webinars are recorded on our website, on the YouTube site, covering everything, every aspect of the application, but really, again, that introspection and where business school fits. So please reach out for a free inquiry. Brendan, I'm delighted that you could join us from Inspirica Pros. Of course, Patty, Rachel, it's always my great pleasure to host both of you. And I know you'll be working with a whole new generation for the admissions cycle to come. Thank you, all three of you.
Thank you.